Hi guys, I hope you're doing well, and in this video we're going to be carrying our discussion further on the rational consumer behavior, right? So we've already discussed what the rational consumer behavior is, that a consumer acts rationally whenever he buys such number of units where the price, the marginal utility in fact from the last unit that he purchases is always equal to the price of the product. So we're going to be talking a bit more in this video, discussing this further, and I'm also going to be representing this concept through the way of a diagram showing the consumer surplus and also showing the deadweight loss of consumer surplus if the consumer acts irrationally. So first of all, guys, remember that whenever the consumer would try to rationalize his consumer behavior. So the word that you should write in the exam is that the consumer attempts to maximize consumer surplus. Remember, guys, the more information you give to the examiner, the better it is for your own benefit, right? You make the examiner happy by providing him with stuff that he wants to actually hear to give you marks, right? So rational consumer behavior is when the consumer tries to maximize, he attempts to maximize consumer behavior, and this philosophy means that the people will actually go on purchasing additional units as long as they gain additional consumer surplus. So I would be purchasing more units only and only if purchasing the additional units give me a marginal utility, that is satisfaction, which is greater than price. So whenever this would happen, obviously I would be gaining a marginal consumer surplus, right? But the problem is that as I consume more and more units, obviously the diminishing marginal utility kicks in and my marginal utility starts to fall, which means that additional unit consumers will be willing to pay less and less, which obviously means that since my diminishing marginal utility kicks in, so I will not be willing to pay more for the same unit because I've already consumed, it. So for additional unit, I will not be willing to pay more that I was willing to pay for the previous unit because of the diminishing marginal utility. But the thing is that I will still keep on assuming that I have to purchase those same units. I will keep on purchasing those units, right? Unless the last unit that I purchase, the marginal utility of that unit, that is the marginal utility of that last unit, is equal to the price of that unit. So whenever MU would equal P, that is a point where the consumer will actually stop purchasing any additional units now, because the amount of money that he's willing to pay for that unit is exactly equal to the price that he's paying for that unit, right? Because you remember that I taught you that in the previous videos, that marginal utility is actually the willingness to pay for an amount. So whenever my willingness to pay for something exactly equals to the price that I pay for it, it means that the consumer should now stop buying that unit, and any further unit that he buys will actually yield him a negative marginal consumer surplus, and that would represent irrational behavior, right? So for instance, let me just make a table because I will also be drawing a diagram out of it. So let's say that I am buying unit A, or whatever you can say, chocolates, apples, whatever, right? So these are my number of units. In fact, I'll write unit here, not units. And I say that this is my marginal utility, my price, and then my marginal consumer surplus. So let's say for the first unit of unit A or whatever, so for the first unit, I am willing to pay $10, and the price, let's say, is it's $6. So my marginal consumer surplus would be $4. And for the second unit, I'm only willing to pay $9 because I've already bought the first unit. So diminishing marginal utility applies here. And the price is 6. So my marginal consumer surplus should be 3. That is 9 minus 6. For the third unit, I'm only willing to pay 8. The price is 6. My marginal consumer surplus is 2. For the second unit, I am only willing to pay 7. Price is 6. And my marginal consumer surplus is 1. Sorry, for the fourth, in fact, not for the third, for the fourth, right? And for the fifth unit, I am basically only willing to pay $6, while the price is $6 as well, and I do not gain any additional consumer surplus. Since marginal consumer surplus is the additional consumer surplus, I do not gain anything. Why? Because I'll be like, for the fifth, if I wanted to buy the fifth unit, then I would only buy it for $6, and the price is $6 as well. So obviously, I really haven't gained anything extra for it, right? Because the concept is that in order to gain $6 of utility, I'm paying $6 of utility. So I'm actually not gaining anything extra by paying $6. While if you consider the third unit, in order to sort of gain a utility of $8, I am paying less, that I am paying $6. So I'm gaining an additional utility of $2, right? A net additional utility of $2, because to gain extra, I'm paying 6. So, I've gained 8, and, there's, in fact, there's a deduction of 6 because I paid 6 for it. So the net gain is only 2, and to gain $9, I'm actually paying $6. So my net gain is only $3 in the form of marginal consumer surplus. So this is quite simple. You already studied it before as well. Now remember, so the rational consumer behavior would be that the consumer will only buy how many units? Consumer will buy 5 units, right? Because the 5th unit that he will buy would be the point where his marginal utility equals to price. So, so he buys the first unit, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. And in total, how many units he buys? In total, he buys 5 units. So that's rational consumer behavior. And at this point, his consumer surplus is maximized. So if I sum it up, that is 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1. So that's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So the total consumer surplus that he has gained is $10. Okay. And now let's now see, what if the consumer starts acting irrationally and he just says, no, I'm still going to buy the 6th unit, right? What if his friend says that, buy the 6th unit, although he doesn't want to buy it, but still he forces him to buy it. So his friend is convincing him to buy the 6th unit. Okay, he's like, okay, fine, I'm listening to my friend, although he shouldn't have. But still, if he buys the 6th unit, then the amount of satisfaction that he will gain from the 6th unit is only $5, while he ends up paying $6 for it, right? Because that's the market price. Which means that in order to gain a utility of $5, you ended up paying more than your gain. So what's happening here is that you're gaining $5 while you're losing $6. So gaining $5 and you're losing $6, which means that there is a negative there's a negative marginal consumer surplus of $1. So you're basically in order to gain $5 of utility, you're paying $6. So the net, there's a net loss in utility, and that is $1. So you're losing $1, right? So I could clearly say that this $1 is representing a loss of consumer surplus. So this is representing a loss of consumer surplus, or you could say a deadweight loss of consumer surplus, because this actually kind of represents the point where the consumer is actually the consumer surplus has actually gone down, because you need to understand that, for instance, if I end up buying 6 units, then if let's suppose I bought the 6th unit, then my total consumer surplus would go down from 10 to, it would decline to $9, right? Because 10 was the amount I gained, 1 is the amount of consumer surplus I lost, which means now my total consumer surplus is only $9. So that is why I could fairly say that $1 represents my deadweight loss of consumer surplus, just a loss of consumer surplus, right? Okay, fine, perfect. And it represents irrational consumer behavior. This is not the point of allocative efficiency, it's irrational consumer behavior. The point of allocative efficiency was this point where allocative efficiency from the consumer's point of view was achieved, right? And this happens whenever P equals to MU. Now I'm going to be showing this by way of a diagram, and I'm going to be drawing a demand curve for that, because why am I drawing a demand curve? Because demand is basically the marginal utility curve, because the reason is that demand represents your willingness to pay, and your willingness to pay is actually the marginal utility, right? So any point on the demand curve represents the marginal utility for that particular unit, right? So let's say that the maximum that I'm willing to pay was how much? The maximum that I was willing to pay was $10, right? That was the highest marginal utility. So I'm willing to pay, the maximum that I'm willing to pay is, let's say, $10, because that's the highest marginal utility that I'm going to be gaining. And I could fairly say that by the way, just to make things simpler, technically it's what's happening here is that the $10 that I'm willing to pay is basically for the first unit. So for the first unit, I'm willing to pay $10. So it's technically like this. But to make my diagram a bit more simpler, I'm going to extend it till the y-axis, right? But anyways, and I'm going to be removing this, and I'm going to be writing $10 over here just to make things more simpler for me, right? So assuming that I'm buying, let's say that how much am I purchasing? I'm purchasing 5 units, because this is the point where no additional consumer surplus is being gained. That is, so at this point, what is going to be happening is that I am basically buying 5 units in total, right? I'm buying 5 units in total, and for the fifth unit I am willing to pay only $6. So yeah, that's about it. So basically you need to understand that this is the point where P equals to mu, and this is the point of allocative efficiency, right? And you see that this triangle, this area, this entire region represents my total consumer surplus, because remember, consumer surplus is the area above the price and below the demand curve. So all this area is above the price and under the demand curve, but that's kind of, sort of, you could say, just a rote learning form of a definition. But the clear idea is that if you see that, this is the first unit, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth unit. So I could clearly see that for the first unit I am willing to pay this much, while I end up paying this much. This is my marginal utility and this is my price. For the second unit I am willing to pay this much, which is my marginal utility, and this is my price. And for the fourth unit I am willing to pay this much, mu, and this is my price. So up till the fourth unit, my mu exceeds my price, my mu exceeds my price, my mu exceeds my price, and which means that and for the fifth unit, by the way, the mu exactly equals the price. So I could fairly say that, all of this area, the blue shaded area, is basically representing what? It's representing my consumer surplus. That is my total. Sorry, it's representing my total. In fact, I should erase this. It's representing my total consumer surplus, right? So the blue shaded area is basically representing my total consumer surplus, right? And if I want to calculate it, I could so basically this is, do you see this shape is basically a triangle, right? And the area of a triangle is half times base into height. So the base is 5 and the height should be 10 minus 6, which is 4, and half times 5 into 4 is basically 10. So $10 is basically the value of my consumer. So total consumer surplus, the value of it is $10, and this kind of exactly matches from the table as well, because that is the exact consumer surplus value that we calculated, assuming that he's only buying how much? He's only buying 5 units, right? But now let's see what is going to happen if he does not buys, in fact, let's now see that what will happen if he actually buys 6 units, or if he buys the 6th unit as well. Okay guys, so basically if I, let's say, and this is the point where P equals to mu, and let's say that I buy the 6th unit. So for example, if this is the 6th unit and I buy the 6th unit, so what is going to happen? So for that, what I'm going to be doing is that obviously this line is representing my price line. So I'm going to be extending it, and let's say this is my price, right? So if this is my price, then, I could say that for the 6th unit, right? For the 6th unit, the price of the product is this much. This is my price, while the amount that I'm willing to pay, that is my marginal utility that I'm going to be gaining from the 6th unit, is only this much. So obviously if I end up buying the 6th unit, obviously that would result into a negative consumer surplus, because at the 6th unit the price is greater than mu, and obviously this region, which means that if I want to measure this region is basically representing my deadweight loss of consumer surplus. If I want to represent this, then I could fairly say that this is my deadweight loss of consumer surplus. It represents the amount of consumer surplus that is going down. It represents the amount of consumer surplus that is lost. It represents inefficiency, because the consumer ends up paying more against the consumer ends up paying more, and the utility that he gains is quite less, and he ends up paying more for that, right? So obviously it's irrational consumer behavior, it's allocative inefficiency, and allocative inefficiency would result into a deadweight loss of consumer surplus. So I could say if I were to erase this, I could say, but in fact I wouldn't erase it, I'll just draw it again, and I'll say that, this point where, if this is the point where your allocative efficiency occurs, or consumer surplus is maximized, because this is the point where the consumer has actually maximized his consumer surplus, and any point beyond that would actually result into a loss of consumer surplus, right? So I could say if this is the price line, then this region, so I could say that this region, in fact all of this region is basically representing deadweight loss of consumer surplus. So all the units that I'm going to be purchasing over here in this region, all the units that I'm going to be purchasing in this region, would be sort of representing, all of this area would be representing my deadweight loss of consumer surplus. It is basically the amount by which your consumer surplus will go down. It brings your total consumer surplus down, right? So whatever you have gained over here, it will be lost, because this is your total consumer surplus at the point where your allocative efficiency had occurred. That is where P equals to mu. And if you sort of purchase these additional units, in fact I'll use a different color, if you sort of purchase these additional units, so your total consumer surplus would go down. That is why this region represents a deadweight loss of consumer surplus, because all of this region, this purple region, is representing those units bought, right, where the price exceeds the marginal utility, hence it's allocative inefficiency. So to make things quite so by the way, you could actually, so a lot of students just say in the exam that allocative efficiency occurs where P equals to mu. So a better version would be where you explain this process, you draw a table, you tell the examiner that this is the point where P equals to mu, that is this point, and you show this by drawing a diagram, and you say this matches with this point. And if you end up buying more units, then it results into a deadweight loss. So yeah, that's about it, right? This is how you represent a deadweight loss of consumer surplus, through showing that any point that any unit that you purchase beyond your optimum consumption. So this is basically your optimum consumption. This is the point where the consumer has acted optimally. So you see a lot of words that I'm using, although they mean the same thing, but the more words you use, the more impressed your examiner gets and the more marks he will give it to you, right? So basically, what do we learn from this video? So let's see, what did we learn in this entire process. We learned that if the consumer will buy 5 units, it means that he has acted, so just a second. So yeah, we have learned that if the consumer buys 5 units, he has acted rationally. Consumer has acted rationally. Allocative efficiency has been achieved at 5 units, which represents rational consumer behavior being done, and it also represents optimum level of consumption has been reached. At what units? If he ends up buying 5 units. However, if he buys any unit beyond 5 units, so for each additional unit beyond the 5th unit, again I'm going to repeat, for each additional unit beyond the 5th unit would represent deadweight loss of consumer surplus, and that would represent unoptimal purchase or irrational consumer behavior, and it would represent serious levels or high levels of allocative inefficiency. And before I end this video, I'm also going to be telling you that, for instance, if this is your demand curve, I think I have already made a video on it, but just let me tell you, I still want to tell you actually. So for instance, if this is your demand curve, so remember that the entire area that is under the demand curve, so the area under the demand curve represents A, B and C, right? So the entire area, in fact, yeah, so that's the area under the demand curve. But I mean, the area under the demand curve that represents our own particular purchases. So let's say if this is the nth unit, right? So the area under the demand curve basically represents our total utility, right? It represents how much utility that you have gained. Because why is that? Because obviously your demand curve is marginal utility. So if you buy, so from here, right, from here till here, if you sum up all the marginal utilities, that is, this is your marginal utility for this unit, this is your marginal utility for this unit, so these are your MUs, right? These are your marginal utilities for each additional unit. So if you sum all these vertical lines, so you end up to a point where you are buying the nth unit, and this is the marginal utility for the nth unit. So which technically means that all of this area that is under the demand curve till here, that is, if I graphically draw it, so this area is basically your total utility. This is your total utility, right? So this represents your total utility. This entire area is your total utility from purchasing nth unit, right? And if you guys can recall, what was total expenditure? Total expenditure was the amount of money that you are spending in order to gain that utility, right? So for instance, let's say that and that area which represents total expenditure is price times quantity, which is this area, right? It's this area. This area represents your total expenditure, because it's telling you the amount of money that you have paid in order to gain that total utility, right? So I could say that I could have done much better way, by the way. So I could have made it easier, but anyways, so I'll just erase this, and I'm going to be writing this as area A, and I'm going to be writing this as area B. So total utility is basically A plus B, while total expenditure is B only, right? So if you deduct this, you basically get total consumer surplus, right? So A plus B minus B and B gets cancelled, so you're only left with area A, which is your total consumer surplus, which means that this region is representing, that is the area above the price, below the demand curve. Again, guys, I mean, this is not just a way to explain consumer surplus. You should be a little more deeper. I mean, you should enjoy what you're saying. So this area represents your total consumer surplus, and yeah, that's about it. That is the perfect way to explain it in the exam, and to just ace those exams and tell the examiner that you are the king. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you all around in the next video, where we are going to be deriving the individual's demand curve from the marginal utility curve. So yeah, that's about it. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, take care.